Welcome to the third episode of the Wrestling with God podcast. This is a podcast from Harmony Hill Baptist Church. It is an apologetical podcast. It was born out of the idea that there were some things I couldn't really deep dive into just for time's sake in my messages during our apologetics series. And so I wanted to use this format to sort of give a little bonus content, if you will. Because I know that maybe you're watching because you have a question that's going to be posed in this episode, or maybe you're watching because you know someone that has this question. You want to know how to start a conversation with them. And so today we're going to be looking at the question, and it is a tough question. What about the person who has never heard the gospel? Or put another way, what about the person who has never heard of Jesus? How does God deal fairly with them? Do they go to hell? Are they good and moral, and yet just because they hadn't heard of Jesus, they will be eternally punished? I mean, these are huge questions. And so I think it's important that we look at what Scripture says first of all. And so in the book of Romans, chapter 1, Paul is outlining essentially why every human being has fallen short of God's perfect standard, why every human being is without excuse in our rejection of God with the knowledge that we have. And so in chapter 1, starting in about verse 18, Paul describes the fact that through creation, that every human is able to be exposed to the invisible attributes of God. Specifically, what he says is that through nature, the invisible attributes of his eternal power and his divine nature are evident through creation. And then Paul goes on to say, because of that amount of revelation, everyone is now without excuse in our rejection of God. So essentially, what Paul is saying is that every human, whether they've heard about Jesus or the gospel, has been given enough revelation that God is eternally powerful. Hence, he was able to create our world and our universe and us. And secondly, that he is divine. He is spirit. He is God. He is beyond us. And because of those two things, we have the option to pursue him or to reject him. And so Paul goes further to say that even though we've been given no excuse through creation, human beings then traded God for the material, those things that we could see. It's like saying we traded the immortal for that which is mortal. We made our own idols, and we've seen that over history, those that made wooden or stone or whatever carved item, a material, an idol to worship. Well, we don't see that as much today here in the West and in the United States, but we certainly have traded the immortal God for our own idols. Many times that idol is pride, our very self. Many times that idol is money and career. Sometimes that idol can be things like our family that we worship and put above any and everything. Sometimes it is hobby, sport. I mean, you name it, we have made idols that we say, this is what is worth investing my life in. This is what is worth the most to me in all the world. And so all of my resources, all of my mental power go towards this. And so Paul would say we are without excuse. We traded the immortal for that which was mortal, that which will perish. And therefore, we have enough conviction that we are accused. The second thing that Paul would say for those that have never heard would be this, is that in Romans chapter 2, right around verse 15, Paul says that each of us have had the law written on our heart. What he's saying is this, as I mentioned in another episode, is that we have the moral law. We have a conscience. We know what is right and wrong. And when we do right, we are affirmed by our conscience, but yet all of us have sinned, so we have all gone against our conscience, and our very conscience accuses us. And so Paul's building the argument that every human being has enough revelation to know that God exists and to pursue him. And two, we have the moral law, a conscience of right and wrong, and even our conscience has accused us that we have done wrong, even against a moral standard. And so when you take that with God's holiness, that even one sin God cannot allow into his presence, all of us have fallen short. All of us are separated from God's glory. So every human being is separated from God by their sin in a fairness of even the revelation that they have received. Now, that doesn't fully satisfy our mind's thought of, okay, maybe you will agree with me that all have sinned, all have a conscience, our conscience accuses us. The question still remains, is it fair for someone, and typically the answer or the scenario is someone in the middle of the forest and a continent that's not been touched by the world. What about them? Why has God not reached out to them? Well, I think right there is a premise that God is not acting fairly when we don't know everything that God is doing. For instance, I mentioned in a sermon not that long ago, but I don't think I mentioned it in every sermon or in every service. That just sort of happens from week to week. But I mentioned that when I went to Niger, West Africa, we met with some pastors. And these pastors have come out of largely an Islamic worldview and background. And there was a pastor there who was previously an imam or a teacher of Islam. And during one of the breaks through a translator, I was asking him, how did you come to faith in Jesus? And what shocked me was that no missionary had come to him. He had not even received a copy of God's Word. But he knew that there was a dissatisfaction. There was something not right with his understanding of who God was through Islam and what he understood, I believe, through his moral conscience and through the revelation of creation. And so he began to pursue God and ask, seeking, and guess what? He told me, I know this is hard to believe, but he told me that Jesus came to him in a dream, shared the gospel with him, and when he woke up, he repented of his sin and trusted Christ for salvation, and now is the missionary in that part of the country as a pastor to others. Look, that's something that I can't predict. That's something I didn't know was happening, but God is fair. And I really believe when God said through Jesus in the Gospels that those who will seek will find. Those who knock, the door will be opened. And what he's saying is this, is when we pursue the truth that God has given us through our conscience and through creation, God will bring us to a saving truth in Jesus. That may be through a dream. It may be through a missionary. It may be through a Gideon Bible. It may be through any number of things, but we just have to trust that God will do his work. I've often wondered, after talking with that guy, that gentleman, that pastor in Niger, the verse that honestly came to my mind is from the book of Esther, where Esther is challenged to go to the king by her uncle Mordecai in order to plead on behalf of the Jewish people that they would not be basically a victim of genocide by an evil plot against the Jews. And the verse that has just stuck out to me is Mordecai tells her, maybe you have come to this place for such a time as this. But the other part of that verse is, but even if you don't act, God will bring forward his plan. I mean, that's my paraphrase. And so when I think about this guy in Africa, I've often wondered, were there Christians who were disobedient to go and be a witness to share the gospel, that God said, well, even though you didn't do your part, my plan will take place. And he gave a vision of Jesus to this man in a dream. And there are numerous people with that same reality. So to begin with the premise that God's not fair, I think is a disservice to the fact that we are finite, we are only aware of limited amount of knowledge, and that God is fair. Another example of his fairness, I think, is in the book of Revelation. at the final judgment, it says that books are opened. And one of the books that is opened is the book of life. Those whose names are in the book of life have been saved by Jesus. The other books record every action, thought, sin, and good deed of all people. It's as if to say God is aware of every human's actions on this planet. And so he is going to judge those that are a part of Christ based on their actions. Now, hear me. What I'm not saying is that they go to heaven if they were a good person. Jesus clearly stated that he is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through Jesus. In the book of Acts, Peter would affirm, there is no other name under heaven by which men and women can be saved. But I do think that there's evidence from some of the parables that Jesus told from this passage in Revelation chapter 20, that in fairness, God will judge, and there are various levels of torment and various levels of reward in heaven, meaning Hitler and the sweet grandmother that was just a morally good person but rejected Jesus Christ are not experiencing the same level of torment, but yet they're both separated from God. Now, what does that mean? It means this, that we have great motivation to share the gospel with the world so that they may hear the truth of Jesus, that those who have sought to follow truth will hear the good news of Jesus. As the book of Romans would later say, after all that setup of the fallenness of man, then it's the beauty of Christ and then the responsibility of the church. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And so if anything, we should be more motivated to do the most loving thing that we can, which is to share the truth of the gospel with those who have never heard it. I'll conclude with this, because there are some that would say, well, maybe if they haven't heard, then God will just save them if they were morally good people. Well, let's think through that logically for a moment. If we send a missionary to a country where they do not have the gospel, and they begin to share the gospel to people, and they reject the gospel, have we done them a moral harm by exposing them to the gospel and having rejected it? Because the logic would say, had we never sent them, then maybe if they were good enough people, God would have saved them. I don't think that we can go down that logical path, because why would Jesus say, go therefore unto the ends of the earth, making disciples, if that actually would be to people's harm rather than their good, to be made known the truth of the gospel? And so with that, it should make you, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ today, it should make you thankful that God revealed his gospel to you and that you've responded to it. That's an unbelievable thing to not take for granted, considering all the people around the world who do not yet have the gospel. But secondly, there is a desire within us that we should say, man, how do we give the greatest gift of the gospel to those who have never heard it? That's the motivating factor there. So God has revealed himself to creation. No one is without excuse. He has put his law on our heart, the moral law, where we are accused or affirmed of our rightness and our wrongness. Our sinfulness is evident to all. Those who seek shall find. God is fair to those who seek him, and he is also fair to those who reject him and would rather trade the immortal for mortal idols. And then it should motivate us to go and share the gospel with the world. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Wrestling with God podcast. In the show notes, we're going to put some resources if you would like to study this more or look at other thoughts and evidences, as we've only really scratched the surface in these few moments together. Also, do me a huge favor. Would you like, share, subscribe, all those kind of things so that we can beat the algorithm and get this to as many people as possible? And let me say this in close. If you choose to share this video with someone, please, please, please follow it up with a personal conversation. These things are best in a dialogue rather than just a lecture format. Thank you again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you the next time you're on the Hill.